Lovely. And we're going to have a little look here, and let's share that as well on the screen, at this module, which I've called to begin with, New Worlds, British and American Literature, 1719 to 1903. And I suddenly realized after that it was probably not the snappiest title ever to be made, and that it sounded quite sort of involved. It's called New Worlds, and that's an important definition between the two here as well, in that there's the idea of the single new world that's not the old world, this sort of age of discovery, but also the idea that all of a sudden there were new natures that were different, that were being discovered, and they're reflected in a lot of the literature of the time. We have, looking back in terms of, we're going to talk about form, and we're going to talk about formats today and genres, and then move on to specifically, we're going to think about novels, because this course does look a lot at novels, and novels kind of developed at the same time, or through the sort of 17th century, 18th century, with travel writing, which a lot of these books are examples of early novels. So we've got traditional forms or formats, like novels, poems, drama, short stories, and novellas. I'm thinking there, moving onwards, we're also going to be dealing with, I don't know how good this, if I do that, does it fill the entire screen? I'm not sure. Can see here next to the graphic novel that we've also, and are going to be using and interweaving in reading and writing on this, in this course, far more modern formats as opposed to traditional literary forms, graphic novels, picture books, comics, films, television. Though the period we're looking at, if we think about Robinson Crusoe, starting off, that's written by Daniel Defoe in 1719. Really, at that stage, that could be almost seen as the first version of the novel. So part of our investigation through these books is, what is, one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, what is a novel? And what a novel seems to do, or begins to do through this time, is it actually presents a single individual viewpoint. It's realistic, and in that sense, that's how it develops out of diaries and travel writing, which a lot of these books seem to be, or present themselves as. I don't know how far you've got so far, but you'll see in nearly all of the books, certainly the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, for example, or Gulliver's Travels, when you first start reading them, or opening them, they're often presented as real accounts, or they are prefaced or framed, as we'd say in literature, by letters, or they're framed as real diaries or memoirs. And so we can see that from traditional sort of travel writing and diaries and memoirs, that, and through travel and exploration out into new worlds, that the novel, this new realistic form, sort of develops. And one of the most important things is that it presents a viewpoint of a single individual. Obviously, today we're quite used to this sort of thing, and we're used to multiple formats. The novel, when you think about it, up until about 1820, 30, was still relatively new, a bit like we might see graphic novels today, or even competing examples like, I couldn't help but go in here as well. You might look at films and television, but we could even think of Twitterature. So I thought I'd look at Neil Gaiman. Do you hear that when it goes through my updates? Neil Gaiman features quite heavily on the English 2 reading lists. And I think some of you who aren't on my courses might have also done The Sleeper and the Spindle with Neil Gaiman and Chris Riddell, for example. When trying to get people to engage in books, and particularly novels, and this is what Morna was saying, I don't like old books. Fair enough, really. They're long, they're long-winded, they put in a lot of detail, and in many ways we could see them as being like the opposite of classic, of sort of communication that characterizes today, which is a world drowned in text. There's a lot of text in today's world. I was thinking about Twitter and thinking about how a story might be told, and I came across what I was looking at. I remembered this anyway, that Neil Gaiman famously on his Twitter feed tried to get people to write in to suggest and build up a sort of fairy tale story out of a classic 140 character Twitter format. And there is a whole sphere of stuff called Twiterature out there. And it's a lovely picture of Neil there as well, I have to say, looking straight into camera. Here it becomes Sam was brushing her hair when the girl in the mirror put down the hairbrush, smiled, and said, "We don't love you anymore." Uh, a Twitter novel or story called Hearts, Keys, and Puppetry. We'll come back to that later and see what we can make of that. It's quite a dense story for something so short, and almost the direct opposite of what we're trying to look at. And it's going to be twofold here, in the sense that not only are we thinking about the fact that you're going to want to go out and deal with teenagers or tweens in your case, Louise, or younger, in trying to get them to engage with longer texts. And there were some great ideas already I saw in your book club reports this morning as well, in the first part, about how we can use multi-sensory learning, how we can use multimodal texts. But motivation is key, and even for you guys as well, in dealing with this kind of literature now that we're going to go back to in order to understand historical periods and English speaking cultures. It's how accessible is it? And here I've written one of the chief issues to address is motivation, with so many other accessible formats like that Twitter novel right there. How do we encourage reluctant readers to engage with books? And to some degree, I guess we're going to have to ask ourselves even that: how are we going to encourage ourselves to engage with Robinson Crusoe? I'm looking at you, Louise, there now, and I know that by telling you that he's from York and he's a Yorkshireman in the original novel, which is something that's almost disappeared in the last version. He's become Pierce Brosnan, being a gent. Um, but how do we engage people? How do we engage students in these books? And how do we even engage ourselves? And the fact that it might be difficult for us mirrors that teaching activity. So it could even be instructive in how, I'm not sharing, am I? We go ahead in this process. Um, I read for you guys on Tuesday as well. I'm going to keep them in because I'm still thinking in these terms when we start off this little section from a book by from a British TV series called Cunk on Britain that I would warmly recommend. It's on the BBC, it's on iPlayer, and you'll find it on YouTube as well. I think I've stuck up some versions on I think it's in a folder on the YouTube channel called Tech Society and Culture. And what this character Philomena Kunk does is she tries to present the sort of mindset of a modern teen who's phone obsessed, and how then that kind of mindset will look back on, in this case, British culture and history. It's superbly well written and well worth a visit. I've taken an excerpt here. I'll put some more excerpts, and the book's also available. It says, in our culture, a book is read from front to back, and with the eye traveling along the line of a text from left to right. The eye then travels back to the left and down to the next line of text, and then from left to right again, and then across to the phone, in case anyone said anything on Twitter, like Neil Gaiman, and then back to the book for a line, then back to the phone, down the screen on the phone for about 10 minutes, then back to the book, but back up a line or two to remember where you were and what was happening, then to the phone again, and so on. And I think one of the worst things is the self-realization as you hear this sort of faux mock sort of adult teen voice, because she's supposed to be in her 20s, but she somehow seems to have hemorrhaged and stuck in this sort of teen mindset. Is that I can see myself doing this. I can see myself sitting there with my clever books that I'm reading as well, and then glancing across my phone just to check if anything's happened that's far more important in the world, that's to do with my friends. Before phones, books were the only thing people had to read, so they could be a lot bigger. Nowadays, big books are only read on long journeys and holidays where the Wi-Fi coverage is patchy, potentially on trains as well then. Some books are good, but they're not about your friends and what they're up to, so they can't be as interesting. And they don't update all the time. So a lot of what happens in books happened ages ago. So it's not as good. I love that as well. It kind of almost mirrors the sort of "I don't like old books" chime, which is true. We don't relate to them because it did happen ages ago. And when you if who's reading Robinson Crusoe? Uh, who was reading Robinson? There was a couple of Robinson Crusoes. Such quiet in this room. Do you think anybody's there, Louise? I can see you are. For those of you reading Robinson Crusoe, you might find that the very first chapter is quite challenging because it is about ages ago, but moreover, stylistically, it could not be further from Neil Gaiman's Hearts, Keys, and Puppetry than you could imagine. Our attention span and being able to follow something that is literally main clause, for those of you who did grammar with me last term, dependent clause, dependent clause, dependent clause, dependent clause. The length and time that is taken is something that we're not familiar with. So this is a challenge for us, definitely, and therefore our own application is going to be interesting and could be instructive in how it could help us thinking about our students as well, or for you, your students. I love this quote which I've picked out. I know you Tuesday guys had this already. A really big bestseller may be read by as many people as watch a 10-minute YouTube video about a teenager unboxing mascara brushes. So books are still a very important part of our culture. That is the yardstick today. It's remarkable to think that my little cousin Jimmy, for his 10th birthday, was given VIP tickets to go and see Ariana Grande. My other cousin Molly, his sister, published the little video. It was a 30-second clip on her Twitter feed, and it had 5 million views by the time I saw him 5 days later. So this immediate accessibility of this abbreviated culture is incredibly important. So we have to think about motivation as a prime starter. And so when I thought, okay, what am I going to be doing this term in terms of thinking about text and culture? I was thinking, yeah, first of all, great, books, this is going to be awesome. How do we approach this? What are the challenges inherent in really encouraging children to, develop this love of reading and to understand that it's rewarding? So looking at motivation, I think it's really important to deal with some of the basic theory. And I don't honestly know whether you've done this or if you've covered a lot of psychology. Anybody in any of your other classes, perhaps you've done, is this something, I'm going to ask you, Louise, because you're right there, which makes you accessible. Has anybody covered any, I've gone off, stuff on educational psychology or?
Not in the English classes. I guess. I mean, we've done it in
Have you?
pedagogy. Quite a
Yes.
lot about motivation. I guess.
Okay.
I guess not. I haven't sort of thought of it directly in relation to reading, but of course I can see.
Good.
I
Okay.
can see how it applies.
I'm not sure what you may or may not have done, and I think it's an important question here, isn't it? First of all, which is how can you motivate people to read, particularly when we're thinking about the fact that there's so many competing interests right there to hand the whole time. So I'm going to touch on today, and I've put in a link for you. I'm going to just bring up and invite you to start off with. This is the same as I know that you did on Tuesday, but we'll be looking at a lot more starting from next week. What I'm going to try and do is bring in a cultural text or theorist, and I'm going to try and bring in an educational theorist every week. So here we've got this lovely, lovely picture of these two badass boys who are psychologists at the University of Rochester. On this side, we have DC and Ryan, and they sound a bit like Cagney and Lacey or a dynamic detective police duo. And they came up or have worked on for 34 years, unbelievably, self-determination theory. So I'm just going to look at it briefly now, because I'm going to invite you to think about it in terms of yourselves in task 2 when approaching a lot of text and a lot of reading and books that you're thinking, okay, God, Robinson Crusoe, it's from ages ago. My daughter would be thinking something from 5 years ago was from ages ago. So we're going to be meeting similar challenges, or you're going to be meeting similar challenges in the classroom. So DC, you can follow the little clip as well, and I'd warmly recommend you to do it. I'm not going to overload you with reading at this point, but if this is something you want to look at, it's well worth learning some of the terminology and framing it. You could also use this to think about characters in a lot of the literature we'll be reading as well. You could think about Robinson Crusoe in terms of motivation, and you could think about Lemuel Gulliver as well in Gulliver's Travels. You could think about all of the characters in terms of what is their motivation and how do they motivate themselves when, for example, stranded on a desert island, a bit like Tom Hanks in Castaway. DC says it was important, looking back to the beginning of their studies, to think about types of motivation rather than amount. And what he meant was back in the day, back in the 70s and 80s, that motivation was really thought about quantitatively, that you were either more or less motivated, and that was it. What they did is they began to look at it far more analytically and think about it qualitatively. There were different types, and therefore produced a basic typology of motivation. Here you can see this guy over here is obviously strongly motivated in some direction. He's one of the pirates, by the look of him, from Treasure Island, saying 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. Now we might wonder whether he is autonomously motivated. Perhaps he just loves piracy. He enjoys it. He enjoys being a cutthroat pirate, and he finds intrinsic value in it. On the other hand, his motivation may well be controlled. He might be in it only for the money, as they say, after the reward, or perhaps it's fear of Blackbeard and what he might do to him, or it could be obligation. And these are the two types of motivation that DC outlines towards the end of his studies: autonomous and controlled. In the beginning, they defined similar categories, which were intrinsic. I think I went into one and sort of pointed out, and extrinsic motivation. So to a degree, we can see them as being synonymous. But DC would prefer you to use autonomous and controlled motivation. I think you'll find a lot of people still use intrinsic and extrinsic. We'll see why, because Ryan took it a stage further. In this picture, and I was going to encourage you in task 2 as well to maybe think about the psychology of literature. Literature is interesting because you could analyze and approach literature purely in terms of a psychological basis, and you can see it as a representation, particularly in the novel, of one person's internal mind. If you think about fairy tales, which we do in English too, we started off that. And for those of you who are doing it at the moment, you might think about this quite clearly. They were externalized and had no signs of internal psychology or interior life at all. But the novel is exactly the opposite. The novel is an examination of one person, the individual. And in that sense, it's probably the most advanced form of time travel ever invented, because it can take you from your time to a completely other time and into the mind and psychology of a single individual. So if you look at that picture, that's the cover, that is, of the Penguin Classics, Daniel Defoe, and it's quite interesting actually when you look at this picture as well, because it's not how I think of Crusoe. In this picture, he looks forlorn. He's sitting on what seems to be a chest that he's salvaged from the shipwreck. And he seems to be rather pensively looking down. His shoulders are slumped. and it's rather a moody picture of him. If you go online and look at other pictures of Robinson Crusoe, he's often seen as being very industrious. He makes the most of what he's salvaged, and he manipulates and controls his environment. He consistently takes stock of all his inventory and lists his assets and everything that he has. He's often seems to be an arch capitalist, that he's out and he increases his capital, and he's out purely for reward and gain. So you could think about Crusoe. He's a very interesting psychological subject. But I'm talking about DC and Ryan. DC and Ryan outline these basic psychological needs that they describe as universal. And that's the power of the novel, to go from the single individual, excuse me, need more ginger, to themes, universal themes here. And they outline these ideas that what you need to be healthy as a human being. You can look at Crusoe and think about this: competence, the ability to do things. And what Crusoe is he is supremely competent. In that sense, he sort of mirrors this colonializing Westerner out in the unexplored, exotic world. You need relatedness, which is belonging specifically to a group. And though he hangs on to what Crusoe finds religion when he's there, and finds belonging in his Christian Puritan beliefs, he also, of course, when he doesn't find anybody else, he finds Man Friday. Spoiler alerts. I hope I'm not giving away too much of the plot. I'm assuming people kind of know the story. He needs that as well. He needs his group, and he needs Man Friday. He needs somebody to belong and to be together with. And then the third psychological need, thinking also about students and teaching perhaps, is autonomy. And this is an interesting typology. I think it's quite instructive and convincing that you might need the ability to be able to do stuff, to belong to a group as you do it, and so have an identity, and also autonomy, which is a concept they borrow from the political realm, the idea to determine yourself. And we think about today, we'll get back to this later in ELT, English Language Training, we talk about learner autonomy, the ability to think about your learning and come up with your own strategies. And Crusoe, as we're talking about him at the moment, we might think about many of the other protagonists in our various books, certainly mirrors these three psychological needs and triumphs over his circumstances. A lot of people see him as being a sort of a representative or symbolic sort of man of the conquering colonial West, but more of that later when we talk about empire and colonialism. So self-determination theory is very often, like I said, you've got this intrinsic autonomous motivation where I would describe how I read, for example. I just love it. And so it becomes something I do. I see its own value. I don't have a struggle as to whether I'm going to watch a film or read a book. I'm quite happy to do it. And for some of you who've worked on my courses before, I've tried to encourage people to write extensively, to just get used to writing and enjoy the process itself, to see interest, enjoyment, and value. And I'd encourage you, hopefully this term as well, is to they were looking into details of educational theory or psychological theory here as well. Concentrate on reading your primary text and enjoying it. Then extrinsic is, we saw before, is synonymous with really controlled motivation. And I guess for many of us in the classroom situation, in this situation as well, we could maybe think that I'm reading the Scarlet Letter or Heart of Darkness because there is a potential reward or there's a negative consequence if I don't do it. However, what Ryan outlines is the idea of a third category in this sort of broader typology, which is integrative motivation. And this is where extrinsic or controlled motivation actually becomes internalized, and he calls it internalized extrinsic motivation. And I suppose that's the continuum that we will work on. When I did English 4 last term, we went from people not liking texts to finding meaning in texts and understanding context and actually ending up liking texts. For example, one of the readings on the list from this year is Remains of the Day. I didn't put it on the reading list last year. Fascinating book, great author, but it's about stiff, stuck-up British people in the 1950s, who are butlers, and it's a world that's very difficult to relate to. For most of that group, the journey was from literally hating something and feeling they were only doing it because they had to. So it was purely controlled and extrinsic motivation, to the point where through approaching that text and finding meaning in that text, they actually ended up quite liking it. And they integrated that into their motivation. It became integrative motivation. It was internalized extrinsic motivation. And the job to do that was for them to go through that journey so that they could then empathize with their students and hope to guide them through that journey as well, as they hopefully maybe don't want to read for the joy of it. I know this is not true for all of you, perhaps, depending on your different age categories. But we're hoping that we can work with that kind of continuum, thinking about moving from extrinsic to integrative, and maybe even that one day just becoming entirely autonomous on its own. So this need for motivation, this continuum of motivation, which we can see in the character of Crusoe there, forlornly sitting on that desert island. He certainly triumphs over his circumstances and becomes autonomous, is one of the challenges of looking at literature. And we can think about it in terms of students in practice, pupils in schools, teens, and we can think about it about ourselves. I certainly do myself. I've also struggled at times with competing media and formats. So one of the things we will be looking at, and we've talked about formats, and I'm sure you guys have also, I know some of you doing English 2 with me now, some of you will have done it before, maybe earlier in spring, is that we think about forms and formats, and then we think about genres, and we think about traditional genres, which are, and still, we can still use comedy, drama, the epic, romance, satire, which I guess Gulliver's Travels would have been placed in initially, and tragedy, and the sort of the picture there, which is from the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. I like to put in pictures that I've taken myself. I was there just in December. That's the face of Alexander, who was obviously the great Macedonian conqueror of the Hellenic world. But these literary genres are really something that were just inherited from the ancient world, from antiquity, until the novel. And the novel, which really starting kind of in a way with, I mean, we could talk about Ephra Bain's Orinoco, another piece of travel writing. Perhaps I should have that in here. It's not really as translatable to being a children's book, but Robinson Crusoe is often seen as the beginning of the novel, which gives this single perspective of a single person's journey into a realistic world. And they give birth to what we see as, genres today. You'll already know, every chance I get to put Benedict Cumberbatch in a presentation, I do, just because I like saying Benedict Cumberbatch. Why would you not? Crime, fantasy, and we'll be looking, Mona mentioned science fiction. For me, Robinson Crusoe, Mona, you might have chosen a Robinson Crusoe because Crusoe is science fiction in so many ways. When you watch Planet of the Apes, you're looking at you're watching Robinson Crusoe and that subgenre of the shipwrecked, stranded man. When you watch Moon with who's in that? Is that Mark Ruffalo? I think so. When you watch The Martian with Matt Damon, when you watch Castaway with Tom Hanks, you're watching Robinson Crusoe. And I've put, obviously, we can recognize a lot of these genres right through to where at the bottom we have travel. And that's sort of where I've sort of chosen to fall a little bit here at the moment, because in all your books we get this idea of travel writing, and it falls in with this early period as well, where the novel sort of develops, and it comes out of this expansion into new worlds. They were, of course, not new at all. They were already there, where people discovered a new nature, a sense of the other, as we'll touch on as we go on, and this exoticness that people then sent back diaries and memoirs. Oh, there's something in the chat room. Now we can see the beginnings of these books in things like, why is it not going onto my chat? Chat's coming in. Sorry, I don't have. It is Sam Rockwell. Oh, that was doing my head in. I love Sam Rockwell. Fantastic film as well. Fantastic. Again, Robinson Crusoe, up and down, no question about it. An important intertext there, Christian. Well spotted and well named. You can think of Marco Polo and the Travels of Marco Polo as being sort of, though he throws in all sorts of sort of mythical beasts. That's back in the 13th century, because there was no way of checking any of these reports. But with the beginnings of the scientific revolution and the travel writing here, this little example is Thomas de Bruy's The Great Travels from 1590. This picture taken from the Louvre in Abu Dhabi as well, where you have this is a very early example of travel writing, and this desire to find out new knowledge, because the ancient world very much had been, the philosopher of the ancient world was Aristotle, and all knowledge existed already. They had all their genres laid out. There was nothing new to be discovered. This period, which I've called New Worlds, is when people suddenly began to understand, and the West began to understand, that the other existed, that there was new knowledge to be discovered, whether it's Isaac Newton or Hobbes in his writings. So I've called this section Travel Writing, the Novel, and the State of Nature, because really this was a meeting of what we thought of nature and new natures, and a questioning of our position in it. And when you think about it, Crusoe, this stranded, shipwrecked, sort of 18th century Tom Hanks in Castaway, finds a friend in Man Friday that he has to name and teach language to, in a world that is entirely foreign to him. Gulliver, Lemuel Gulliver, the good doctor in Gulliver's Travels, follows maps around the world and is shipwrecked, yet again shipwrecked, mostly again on islands in strange and exotic new settings where nature is different. And what all these people seem to learn is new ideologies and mindsets and senses or understandings of our own old world. So let's have a think about, because it's going to come back and it's important, let's have a think about travel literature. Lovely picture there. That's one of the color plates and illustrations. It's the Hispaniola off Treasure Island in Treasure Island, which is a book, if anybody wants to read that, you could definitely see as being part of this genre and period as well. A children's classic that has been rewritten many times into different film adaptations. In Treasure Island, I might add, there's a Robinson Crusoe. There's a guy on the island who happens to be there called Ben Gunn, who walks around in tatty old feathers and his furs and is half mad. And he's rather like a Robinson Crusoe who was left on the island. Again, a repeating of that same sort of literary figure. But travel literature, like all genres, it's like any model. It's a convenient name to sort of like talk about something and group it together. Could be lots of different things, and some of them are very important. And I've just listed or thought about a few. If I were at home, I would have got out my ancestor, Captain William Buck Keeling's journals from the journeys because he went out on a journey in 1609 and they discovered islands, and I've got their original journeys in copies. But you can think about some travel diaries and narratives that are really important. Captain James Cook's diaries were widely read. Botanist Joseph Banks was also on that boat, and they went to Australia. They discovered Tahiti. There'll be pictures, and we'll come back to that later, because there they discovered savages that were savages, but apparently living in paradise on these desert islands when, all the women were beautiful and they had this wonderful life. Thinking about guidebooks, I didn't put anything specific in there, but if anybody does read Remains of the Day, which is a wonderful book, a lot of it is based around a guidebook that keeps on appearing in the text of that book that's called The Seven Wonders of Britain. But you can think of all sorts of guidebooks that were written during these periods and following journeys. We've got nature writing and outdoor literature, and something we might draw on at a certain point is Henry David Thoreau's Walden. Classic from sort of 1854. You see there, it's basically travel, it's nature writing. It's about a guy who goes to live in a cabin for a while and keeps a journey or writes about it. You could also think about natural histories that were written during this period. Some of these books are very important. Charles Darwin's Diaries of the Voyage of the Beagle could be included in this, from 1841. As you can see, all the way through this period, I haven't included a lot of the earlier ones. Robinson Crusoe is based on a real account of somebody who was shipwrecked. Moby Dick by Herman Melville, which could have been put on this reading list, but is a very big book, is based on true accounts of a rogue white whale. But alongside that then develops travel fiction. Could call it travel fiction, travel writing, but the actual fictional aspect of it, which kind of presents itself as being real, as being realism, but is fiction. So it sort of kind of interrogates that genre, and yet what it does is it introduces themes on top, which are normally questioning our own society, our often religious views, which had been dominant up to this point as well. Most people believed that, still right now, the world was about, let's have a look, 1719. I think most people would have believed that the world would have been about 4,300 years old, and that if you added up everybody in the Bible, that's what you'd get, and that the world was made in 7 days, and it was made once, and there was one creation, and man was made Lord of all of it. And obviously, going out and finding out that there were completely different natures with completely different peoples, obviously drew questions of all of this. And Crusoe clings to his religious belief. In fact, is almost has an enlightenment in it, and we'll find those kind of themes throughout all of these books as well. So it's quite important.
Golly.
Yeah.
Could you put Dracula, would that come in, or is that a bit too modern? I was just thinking there's sort of travel in that kind of, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Lovely book as well, Bram Stoker. It's a shame I'm not at home. I've got several copies of that. To a degree, yes, because they're traveling to somewhere. It's a diary, and it's a reconstruction. We'll see in the conventions. It's based on memoir, somebody remembering something, where you go to an exotic land that was probably still unmapped and unknown at that time as well. And obviously then, the events that come out of it, I could definitely see that as being part of that genre. And moreover, that's written at the same time as Frankenstein, which is also a bit of travel writing when you look at it. And that same kind of group of Gothic authors who wrote stuff. So absolutely, travel writing, So what we can see, Louise, is it's not just like, oh right, this is a bit of travel writing. You'll find it comes into different books constantly. This idea of going away, of coming back, of sort of finding something exotic or other, of getting lost or shipwrecked, an island. There are certain motifs, certain conventions that you'll recognize in quite a lot of literature, and they're to do with the fact that that's how the novel kind of developed as well. This need for realism, and so Crusoe presents itself as if it's a real account of somebody who was lost, and lots of people believed that they were as well. So we can find lots of examples, and that's a very good one. That's a very good, and that's exactly in that corridor of really when novels became popular. Mostly, I might add, at that stage as entertainment for ladies, as opposed to the rational amusement that was afforded to gentlemen. But then, of course, printing, locomotion, new middle class who could afford to read. All of a sudden, you had sort of gothic horror stories and penny numbers, and all of a sudden, it's in the 1840s that sort of reading becomes really widespread. Dickens was a superstar in the 1850s. So travel writing, you can have a look here as well. Some of the genre conventions. To be honest, I didn't go anywhere. I just sat in my head and thought, what is this kind of stuff? At the possible expense of missing something out, because I can see I didn't write an island down here as well. I know I said to you on Tuesday, and I'll say it again, I don't know where everybody else is in terms of English 2 and what you covered. You might have been given a list of literary terms. At some point, if you're obviously in secondary school, you're going to need to use certain technical terms, I guess. I'm a firm believer that you do not need to be overly wordy. Your explanation of something, particularly in school, but even at university level, it doesn't have to be more complicated than the thing itself. It doesn't always apply, but I think I said on Tuesday, I'll say again, I'll keep on saying that subject, theme, character, setting, story, and perspective are for me, some of the main terms that I work with when I talk about stories. That could be because I'm what you call a historicist, and I believe that literature is history. So Crusoe is as good an account of his time and that history as a history book could possibly be. So that means I tend to look very strongly at these issues. So subject, in terms of conventions, we'll develop this, and I'm doing the same one as you're getting in English 2 as well at the same time, because it's important to sort of cover these organically. I often see these terms in a list, two listed, and you can't really think about them in lists. You should get involved. Subject is what something's about. So you could say travel writing, it's about, what's the subject? Well, it's travel. It's got to have something to do with somebody going somewhere in some sort of form of travel. But theme is the meaning you get out of something, what it's actually saying about it. And theme does not have to be the same as subject. Bend It Like Beckham might be about football, if you remember the film, but it's about friendship and a whole lot of other stuff. So the themes involved are quite separate to the subject. They could also be shared. So in travel writing, very often you do have the same kind of subjects, which might be a voyage of discovery, whether it's gone well or gone not, a journey into the unknown, which, Louise, I'd say Dracula is on all counts, into the unknown or an unknown nature. So you get things like islands or lost worlds. Could think of Candide, where they end up in El Dorado, which is where we get that saying from. It's like a weird sort of valley in the middle of nowhere. These sort of lost or unknown natures, navigating rivers, we'll come back again and again in Huckleberry Finn, in Tom Sawyer, in The Heart of Darkness. Other themes will be things like meeting the exotic. You could say the subject is the exotic. That's not really a subject, but it's the meeting with the exotic, the discovering of an unknown nature of the other, which is what we can use both for nature, but mostly for humans, the human other, that there's a Man Friday out there. And I'm hoping that we could think about Man Friday still in terms of how we meet the other today, and it's incredibly relevant. It could be themes of human endurance and perseverance, which we definitely see in Crusoe, and of course, a basic questioning of human assumptions, which is generally what travel writing does. It kind of also comes out of another genre called the fantastic voyage or journey, which you can see in things like Gilgamesh or Cervantes, Don Quixote. This sort of like when somebody goes away to fantastical land and comes back with a magical amulet. Travel writing it comes out of that to a sense through Marco Polo, where you go away and you find you ask questions like, what is the state of nature? And conversely, which is why I've called this, of course, which all our books have as probably their main theme, is what is civilization? So what's nature and what's man's place in it, and what is civilization? Or even in 19th century terms, civilized, as you can see there, versus savage. And in all our books, particularly, let's think of Gulliver's Travels. You can watch Jack Black rather amusingly in his version, but I would definitely say to you, go and watch Ted Danson. I don't know if you've seen the Ted Danson version from BBC. It's a two-parter. It's magical, and Ted Danson's actually very good in it. That's the shocking part. But at most points, what's civilized and what is savage seems to be inverted. In Call of the Wild, Morna, of course, our dog Buck, is a civilized beast, but he's from a lovely family. He belongs to a judge, and he's used to all this beautiful garden down in Seattle. In the end, he's confronted with a very savage world out in the frontiers. So this idea of civilization versus nature, and what is nature? Is nature savage? Is it paradise? Runs through all of these books. I'd have to say it's a theme that you'd probably be able to find in any book today and still think is relevant today as well. You can see some computing there. You can think about that later as well. I think you'll be able to address that and how this is an important theme. In terms of characters, you often have a voyager or a traveler. For the tale to be told as well, there has to be a diarist, a journalist, or somebody who the story's been told to. You often have, rather like in Crusoe, I think I was just mentioning to you, Louise, when you're doing the group work, there's the BBC children's classic Play. Do you go and see plays are great as well? It's a radio play. There's Old Crusoe and Young Crusoe, and so you've got that sort of that doubling of the main character, who's one who's actually in the experience and the other one who's reflecting on it. Typically, we will have some kind of meeting with the other, the savage, the primitive. That could be an animal, like Spitz in Call of the Wild, which you'll see. If you're not going to read that book, then watch the film. You will love it. It's fantastic. Or White Fang. I mentioned Moby Dick earlier. Meeting that primitive savage, the other. It seems to be, first of all, the white whale, Moby Dick. But in the end, there's the question as to whether it was actually Captain Ahab who sacrifices everything to try and slaughter this whale in revenge, who is the other, the savage, the primitive. Going over mythical creatures, travels in Marco Polo. Travel is often episodic, and this is something to think about as well in terms of its characters and its structure of the story. So this could belong later down in my fourth category down there, which is you're going to have a main character and they're going to meet, normally in a linear fashion. Characters are going to turn up and they're going to come in different episodes. So in Huckleberry Finn, where Nigger Jim, that's what he's called, and Huck go on this journey on down the river, down the Mississippi. They meet characters who don't come back in the story. They come upon episodes and they meet new people, and it's all episodic in its setup, which means you get a cast of minor characters who don't even come back into the story again. This could be, if you're going to get very literary, you'd like to see Voltaire's Candide, for example, which is exactly the same thing, but in the story, it's just bizarre. People die, but they just come back again and they turn up again later, even though they died in earlier scenes. Candide sort of gently mocks this in Voltaire mocks it in Candide, which was banned throughout Europe but printed in Holland. We've got setting and thinking about setting, and one of the most important things about travel writing is vivid and detailed description. In the initial genre, which is why Crusoe could be quite a long book. Interestingly enough, Heart of Darkness, if any of you read it later, is also a piece of travel writing where we seem to go internally into a psychological landscape and maybe don't get as much detailed description as possible. The setting, of course, reflects initially the exotic, often the fabulous, and the new worlds in the title of this lecture, let's say, or module, and a new nature. Other settings, of course, that are important that I could point to are shipwrecks, rivers, and it should say islands, of course, after that. My mateys. And then one of the other things, or the other things that we need to look at, and I've already touched on as well, is story. And story just is the stuff that happens in the sequence it happens. And then how that story is told, which gives you the plot. Some people don't like to use that word. Some people just call it the narrative because you've got a narrator. And that's the way the story is actually mediated or told. Very often that's told through changing perspective. And I'm hoping, for those of you who've done English 2 before, and for those who are doing English 2 with me this term as well, this is a rich area for working with literature. First person, second person, third person, different perspectives, looking at how different characters would see it, telling stories from the perspective of different characters. So this is a really, really important, for me at least, area of any storytelling and any text or literature. And so here we've got the story as it is of a journey, voyage and travels. The plot, how it's organized or sequenced. Often we said there will be old Crusoe, young Crusoe. So you've got a slightly more reflective first-person narrator and another first-person narrator. However, you could have the direct report, which is the diary or the journal. That's also very often first-person narrator. That could also be, like I said, reconstructed, which is like a memoir. Narration might be afterwards, as I've written down there as well. So I'm thinking aloud, but I'm seeing I've written the same thing at the same time. You may well then slip to a third person scientific observation voice as well, because at the same time as this realism and travel writing and the idea that there's new knowledge to find out in the world, that comes along at the same time as the scientific revolution. So there are links between the scientific revolution and the scientific mindset and the realism of the novel. So you might find that often in travel writing, and that's one of the important tropes, how it plays on the fact that this could actually be real or not. Right, it's quite a lot of info. That's some of the ways that when I sort of sat and thought about, wow, how do I get hold of this? I don't expect you to grasp everything out of this at once, but this is a priming function, a pre-reading thought and idea, really to sort of like, sow seeds or prompt you in your reading process in how you might think about travel writing. And I couldn't stress enough that there's just thinking about subject and theme, characters, setting, story and perspective, though there's lots of other things you can be doing, but that will take you a long way for me. You can do a PhD with that. You'll be fine, I promise. I love this. Chris Riddell is a genius to my mind as an illustrator. And I'm sure most of you have already come across some of his books because I put them continuously on any of my playlists, whether it's Goth Girl. I don't know if anybody knows Goth Girl or Ottoline, or they're all sorts of fantastic. They're all over there. I desperately want to go and get them. I'd love to be at home. I wish I was at your library there, Louise, so I can grab my books off. This illustrated version is fantastic. And if you don't know Gulliver's Travels very well, the Hwinem, the horse people, the horse folk, let's say, that Gulliver meets in his final episode are gentle, beautiful, civilized creatures. However, the humans, they call them Yahoos. Who would have thunk years later it would be the name of a not very popular search engine? But Yahoos that embody this question about the state of nature. What is a human? Because Gulliver goes out on this fantastic voyage, which nobody believes, and he meets himself, really, or what he himself is or might be or could be. I'll touch on this a lot more later because I'm very interested in science. Obviously, this can evolutionary ideas were already germinating at this time, and he's kind of like facing down sort of what he suspects he might really be, nothing more than a Yahoo, a savage, and that is himself. All he has is his clothes, his finery, his ruff, and his frock coat on with his stockings. Look, and the horses, the Hwinem. I'm not giving away too much because this is just one episode. Confuse him. They don't know what he is because he doesn't smell like a Yahoo and he doesn't look like a Yahoo. But when on a hot day Lemuel goes swimming and a female Yahoo steals his clothes because he's got a bit of a red barnet, he's a bit of a ginger, as you can see up there, and she thinks that he's sexually fertile. So she steals his clothes and he's naked. And when the Hwinem see him naked, of course, they understand that he is a Yahoo. Wonderful episode. It doesn't ruin the book because there's just so much in Gulliver's Travels. If you're not reading it, do watch it and go for that Ted Danson version because it's fantastic. So this question right here for me is what I was thinking about, particularly for a lot of these books. Not when I first chose it, but when I thought I was trying to mirror how the course used to be done, thinking about there was an American bit and there was a British bit to it, and I thought, no, it's not about that, though I've called it British and American literature just to be safe. The question here is, what is the state of nature? And there's so much I would have loved to have pulled in today and been desperate to do, but we've got time to start off with one important for me theorist, philosopher that informs this kind of stuff and is still pertinent today, if you ask me. Thomas Hobbes, in 1651, writes this book called Leviathan. There won't be a test on this later, do not worry. In the frontispiece, I don't know if you can see this clearly on the cover there as well. There's a sort of supreme or absolute monarch who's this giant Leviathan. Now, in ancient and Near Middle East culture and in the Bible, Leviathan is the beast in the depths, in the primordial ocean, who's, I think in the Babylonian myth, it's Marduk and Tiamat. Marduk slays Tiamat, makes the earth out of like the dragon, if you will. It's the same as the dragon in Arthurian legend, or maybe Leviathan as in Moby Dick as the white whale. But this sort of Leviathan beast, who is the body politic, the supreme monarch, is made up of thousands and thousands of tiny individuals. And this it's a very potent symbol. You can have a look at it as well. You'll find if you have a look as well. And I've given you a handout to go with it as well. Just taking this quote out and plucked it out just to think and go alongside it. To this war of every man against every man. This also is consequent. that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have there no place. Okay, again, this is why old books are a bit difficult, aren't they? Because it's kind of like back to front as well, how that's expressed. That bit, war of every man against every man, it means every man literally, as in, it was actually in the original version written like this: bellum omnium contra omnes. And it becomes a description, an important description of the state of nature. And it means the war of everybody against everybody else. So in his primal, primitive state, man, as it was used then, okay, I'm going to try and use my terms from the time rather than update it, was a savage. So nature is savage, and it's only through supplication to some supreme, absolute power that this savagery could be stopped. And Hobbes is a really important political philosopher, and he informs the mindset of people like Crusoe, even if they purport to be Christians, and the mindset of possibly in the beginning Lemuel Gulliver and the men back in court who listen to his story and do not believe his tales of mythical places. I'm going to read finally an excerpt from the reading, because I've given you reading one, because I'd like you to just have a look at it. I don't expect you to get sort of something out of it and distill a little bit out of it. I'm going to read it for you. I'm going to give it to you in your groups as well. It's in the task 2 description, so you can just have a look. This is right from the bottom of page 2 and the first paragraph at the beginning of page 3. And here, as Gulliver meets the Yahoo, it says, hereby it's manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war as is of every man against every man, bellum omnium contra omnes. The war consisteth, so it's got the old language, isn't it? Consisteth not in battle only or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known, and therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war, as it is the nature of weather. Again, it's a bloody long way to express the fact that war is like weather, basically. It is just part of the natural order of things. For as the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto during all the time there is no assurance to the contrary. All other time is peace. So basically, unless you do something about it, just in the way that the weather in England is going to be shit, sorry for those of you, or it's going to be snowing up where I am, or it's going to be rainy and grey here in Denmark. That's the state of things. That's the state of nation. It's every man for himself. It's all against all. And if you leave humans to themselves, they are nothing more than yahoos. It's funny enough, this becomes the excuse for colonialism in the 19th century, and it develops very well. Here in this little, this is an illustration from a children's classic. And it's, if you look at the picture as well, obviously you've got the firm and supple buttocks of Man Friday supplicating himself before Crusoe, who's just slaughtered everybody else he knows. Crusoe just looks weird in this as well. If you look at that picture, don't really know what to make of his strange ashen face in this at all, but often you can see he's very similar to pictures of Ben Gunn in Treasure Island. He seems to have kitted himself out like, I don't know, like Robin Hood meets the Flower Pot Men. I'm not really sure what's going on there. Let's go back to Leviathan. Whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time or war where every man is enemy to every man, the time is same as consequence to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition, there's no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation or use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, savage and damning. Basically, without civilization, man is nothing. Humans are nothing. They're a savage. And obviously, it allows the civilized man free rein to do what he likes with the savage, to be honest. Because what is the savage without him? Nothing. No culture, no commodities, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no arts, no letters, no time, no society. The war of every man against every man. And this idea that without civilization, we're savage is really important. I'm going to see how it plays out against other ideas about nature and the state of nature from our time. And we'll be looking at John Locke, the Scottish empiricist, whose words are in the Declaration of Independence. Pretty much it's mirrored on his ideas, and he believes in natural law and rights, which here man has none. And we'll also be looking at how this might play out against ideas like Charles Darwin as well. And even up to today as well, the question of the civilized man, person, human, and normally it is man as well, against the savage, how we could even, you could see Trump here sort of saying to him, you've got a shit country, and him thinking, God, I don't want to have anything to do with you. That this is still a question that can be brought up and thought of in terms of contemporary fiction and culture. Right, okay, we'll stop there because we're doing quite well on timings at the moment. Let me go to, I was probably going to do a little bit shorter. As you notice, I get quite into it. This is a really, really interesting period in time, and I don't expect you to share my sort of huge burning passion, but what I want is you to take something away from it and put it into your context. So in the task that's to go with this, we will have a break and then we'll set you off to your tasks. Let's have a look. We have to go into, of course, syllabus all the way through the Emner plan, which I will take away, I think, because it's a bit annoying. And then I'm going to click on the calendar. So the savage and the civilized. It's such a relevant. Well, let's see what you make of it anyway. I'd like you to. You can go back to your same groups. I've highlighted those very same excerpts because the language is not easy. I think we'll all agree. I'd like you to. You can glaze up and down if you like, but those two paragraphs, if you're going to choose everything from Hobbes, and Hobbes is seen as being super important, they contain the two quotes. You can guess the killer quotes. One I've picked out, and the other one is the last line. So in your groups, if you want to, you can discuss. You could read out loud is always good, or you can just read out loud those little bits. Then I know you probably haven't even read your texts at the moment. But the second thing I've said is, in terms of discussion and your reading is this idea of, life being just shit, nasty, brutish, poor, short, and that everybody is against everybody else. Think about, I know I've already started thinking about that, how you might relate that to some of your set texts for module 1 that you did or discussed earlier. Or Sam Rockwell, Christian, if you fancy it as well, in Moon as well. You don't have to stick with those set texts at the moment. They could be intertexts, because we know Crusoe already. We've seen Crusoe's going to keep on appearing again and again and again, which is why those themes are relevant. And then that second question is, so how is this theme about what is savage and what's civilized? Is it us? Is it the West? Oh my gosh! Now there's a lot coming out. How can we relate that maybe to the modern day? Now, I've pointed up quite a lot already, and we're just beginning, so I'm not asking, I don't expect too much of yourselves. Just think about some of these ideas. I was thinking about Man Friday in that picture there as well. You know, things are pretty bad for Man Friday most of the way through known history. You know, in what sense can you think about things like, you know, the Black Lives Matter campaign at the moment, and you know, I don't know if anybody's seen the hate you give at the moment. You know, like people not making a fuss about you know, a black kid getting shot, and all of a sudden the news report will say he might have been a drug dealer, and that's it, game over. Is it that far away from Crusoe just slaughtering natives, or the confrontation with the Yahoo? So that's that question about savage and civilized. What does that mean? It still seems to be, for me, a theme that's important. Can you think about that? And then it was Hobbes. It was the theme. And number three is, we also talked about motivation. What did you make of what I said about motivation? We can think about motivation in terms of the books. With students, are the themes intrinsically motivating? Are they relevant? How can we think about some of the material? I know lots of you have already started sort of talking about that. If you have, can you develop that and structure it more? Are there particular texts or intertexts? Christian's got Sam Rockwell going on over there. We're thinking about Matt Damon in The Martian, all sorts of Crusoes, not just Crusoe, Crusoe's all the way through. And then you can even think about that idea of motivation if you want to. I like thinking about it in terms of characters in books as well, because the novel is about being able to see the mindset and being in the mind of a single person. A film can't do that for you. A video game can't do that for you. Virtual reality can't do that for you. Nothing else can do that for you. The one area where the book, the novel, is superior to any other form of technology is nothing else except for a Vulcan mind meld, which I'm pretty sure is not a thing yet, can actually put you in the mind of one other person and see from their perspective and actually be them practically. So think about what's Crusoe's motivation. Might just point out as well, except for Buck, who's a bit of an alpha male himself in Call of the World. We've also got Hester, obviously, in the Scarlet Letter. A lot of the characters are often white male characters as well, so we might consider what we can get out of gender and ethnicity. So there's a whole raft of stuff, and the most important thing is what grabs you and where you go naturally in your discussion. I'd like you to think about it, and I'd like you to create a document as usual. I'd like you to try and structure your discussion, which means, yeah, you might repeat it, but that's because you want to say a bit more about it. And then I'd like you to do a short recording at the end, because I think that's really good practice, and we can just get used to it. And what we're doing there is we're working towards our examination later, aren't we? Because you're going to present in a structured discussion your term paper, and at the end you need to sort of defend it, and that's what that is. It's a structured discussion where you sort of summarize and develop your arguments. Okay, so it's direct practice for the exam. And then we'll come back just for the end for a roundup, and we'll maybe have like a little open chat, 5 minutes. So to finish off today as well. I know it's a lot. We've just started, but focus on what interests you or where the discussion takes you. So it's 2 o'clock now, so we are roughly on time. I'd like you to stay in the same groups. You may incorporate a break as you see fit. So maybe you want to start, have a discussion, and then have a break in the middle. I'd like us to reconvene at 3 o'clock, 1500. Just for a quick final summing up. Very short, really, because I don't like going through things. And I will be round. You can stay in the same documents, so I can then come in and look at what you're doing and give you any support. Okay, any questions at that stage? I know it's a lot of info. Was the task relatively clear? You do have points to follow if you need the support. A lot of these I see you've already touched on, so it's developing maybe what we started off doing in our first task today. Okay, awesome. I can stop recording. I can stop the recording. Goodbye to everybody on the video following this lecture on YouTube. Thanks. Obviously, that was quite a long session in the end, though, an hour and 15. Do excuse my passion, because this is an area that I love, and it's very dear to me. I hope you can now go away and approach task 2, which is in the syllabus on the list, has just been explained there in the lecture as well. And think about Hobbes and this view of nature. It's very sort of 17th, 18th century, and how it can then maybe play out in these novels and intertexts and update into today. And think about motivation as an overlying educational theme, or even in terms of the characters in it. Okay, enjoy, have fun, make it so.